Welcome to the Raymond A. Mason School of Business Alumni Webinar, Entrepreneurial Thinking, presented by Clinical Professor and Executive Director, Alan B. Miller Center for Entrepreneurship, Graham Henshaw. My name is Eliza Parrish. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement for the Mason School of Business at the College of William & Mary, and as is always the case, this webinar is offered as a part of our pledge to you to provide you with opportunities for lifelong learning and professional development. Graham Henshaw is a clinical professor at the College of William & Mary's Raymond A. Mason School of Business and Executive Director of the Entrepreneurship Center. Prior to joining William & Mary, Graham was the Director of Venture Development at New Richmond Ventures, a Richmond-based venture capital firm investing in early-stage, socially driven startups. Graham brings to William & Mary a diverse background in product development, Fortune 500 strategic consulting, and entrepreneurship. He leveraged his varied skill set to found Active Innovation Group in 2007, a company that created innovative accessories for athletes, most notably Paystat, which was then acquired in 2010. As a strategic consultant, Graham has worked with companies including General Electric, Kraft Foods, Toyota, and GlaxoSmithKline to create products, services, and messaging consistent with deep consumer insights. Graham has been teaching in the areas of entrepreneurship and innovation and design at the Raymond A. Mason School of Business since 2012. He earned an MS in mechanical engineering and a BS in mechanical engineering with a minor in industrial design from Virginia Polytechnic Institute. And with that, I hand it to you, Graham.
Well, hello, everybody. It's a little odd because I can't see everybody, but I'm glad that everyone's here. We started out with this polling question, and as I sometimes do with my students, that was a trick question. This was a little bit like the guess how many jelly beans there are in the jar, and I think we're going to remove that polling question, then I'm going to reveal the answer. And so it looks like the most popular answer there looks like about 1,000. I'm going to show you the answer here in just a second once we've got the polling question off. And so the answer is 0. So maybe that's a surprise, certainly to the folks who said it was 1,000. We actually looked at something different, and that's going to be what this webinar is really all about. Rather than looking at business plans, we looked at something that told us a little bit more about whether or not these ventures would be a good venture to get involved with. Before I go any further, I just want to give a shout out to my friends at New Richmond Ventures. I know they've gathered some folks there to participate in this webinar, so hey everyone. So here's why we didn't look at business plans, particularly in the early stages of venture screening. The top image here is what a typical business plan looks like, right? We're going from A to B, and everything's smooth. We just need some money to execute this plan, and we're all going to do well at the end, at the finish line. But we knew that it didn't really look like that. The reality, the real picture, was that of the image that you see below. And many times entrepreneurs don't see these pitfalls, these hurdles that are going to be in the way of the start and the finish line. But we saw that. So we wanted to look at something different. We wanted to look at, frankly, a tool that would enable us to tell whether or not these businesses had some likelihood of success. So we're going to talk about that for the duration of the webinar, but in order to jump into that, I want to first show you an exercise that I do. People are not hearing us, it looks like. I'm seeing in the chat. Oh, perhaps there's something going on with the audio on your end. So I'm going to share with you an exercise that illustrates this idea of entrepreneurial thinking. And so this is an exercise that I do with students. At this point, I've actually done it close to 100 times. And in fact, I'm going to do it tonight with a group of accounting folks. And that should be a fun exercise. This is the Marshmallow Tower Challenge. And many of you all actually may have done it as an icebreaker at some functions. It's a fun exercise that I do with students at the beginning of a lot of my classes that I teach. And I've done it with undergrad students, with grad students, with executives, with entrepreneurs. The idea behind the Marshmallow Tower Challenge is that teams of 4 or 5 are given some items, and they have to build the tallest tower that they can using these items. And so what they get in a bag are 20 sticks of spaghetti, a yard of string, they get a yard of tape, and a full marshmallow is in the bag. And so what they have to do again is build a marshmallow tower, or build a tower out of those materials in 18 minutes that can support a full marshmallow on the top. And so we give them the rules, and then we say go. And what's really interesting is that now that I've done this so many times, I'm starting to notice patterns. And this is usually what I see at the end of 18 minutes. I see sad towers, or I see towers that have completely fallen over. If I've got a class or a group with 10 teams, if I've got one team that still has a tower that remains standing at the end, I think we're doing pretty well. So it turns out that there's a group of people that consistently does really poorly at this exercise. And this is in my experience and also those who have done this exercise around the world. So it turns out that that group of people is actually recent MBA graduates. And so there's a flip side to this. There's actually a group of people, and I'm going to explain why MBA graduates don't do so well in just a minute. There's another group of people that does really well consistently, building very tall towers, creative towers, taller than the MBA students. And that is recent kindergarten graduates. So on average, they build these really creative and tall towers, taller than MBA students, and I can't make this up. We just need to follow the marshmallow to find out why this is happening. And it's really fascinating, and I've seen this in action. So what you see when you follow the marshmallow is this. So on top, you have the recent MBA graduate, and on the bottom, you've got the kindergartner. So really two things are important here that I want you to take away. The first is that kindergartners don't make really big assumptions without testing them pretty quickly. And the second is that they test their assumptions in an iterative way. They prototype something, they test it, they create an experiment, they learn from that, but then they do it again, and they repeat the process. And they start that right at the beginning. So they are creating experiments and learning something from them. Whereas the MBA students, on the other hand, make a fundamental assumption early on, and they don't check it until it's too late, and that is that the marshmallow is inconsequential. And so when I watch teams do this, I often see the marshmallow sitting still for about 17 minutes, and then someone on the team remembers, oh, we have to put the marshmallow on the top. And that's the first time that they touch the marshmallow. And the kindergartners are not that way. So checking fundamental assumptions, critical. Prototyping and iterating, these are essential things, obviously, in the Marshmallow Tower Challenge. And I think we've literally taught these things out of our students. But what we know is that these things are not only essential to building tall spaghetti towers, it turns out that they're essential in entrepreneurship as well. So these are the same tools, the same things we need to build new ventures, launch creative ideas. Which, by the way, is why we're all about something called entrepreneurial thinking at the Allen B. Miller Entrepreneurship Center. Rather than being startup-centric, we're actually all about teaching and cultivating this entrepreneurial thinking skill set and mindset. So these things together are called entrepreneurial thinking. So on the skills, we have opportunity discovery. So this is the ability to spot opportunities where others don't see them. Maybe others see problems or they don't see anything at all. So then the next thing is failing wisely. And this is a very important skill set, certainly important to teach to our students who have frankly been rewarded for not failing. That's how they got into William and Mary. But failing wisely is actually risking what you can afford to lose and also having learning as the central focus. Improvisation is that next skill. So this is the ability to put something out into the market, but observe the market reacting to it and course correct. This is a really important skill. And finally, collaboration, being able to pull in other perspectives, recognizing that you're not going to bring everything that you need to the table to solve these tricky, tough challenges. So those are the skill sets. And on the mindsets, there are 4. that correlate with these skills. And so the first is openness to risk. This is turning towards opportunity even when there might be risk of failure. So the next is tolerance for ambiguity, and this is being able to put yourself out there when there isn't really a roadmap, when you don't know exactly what the problem is. We want to have students, we want to cultivate this ability within the folks that we interact with to be able to tolerate that ambiguity and figure out a path forward. Something that will be advantageous to those charting that path forward is grit or persistence in the face of challenges. And finally, we have self-direction. And this goes back to that lack of a roadmap. We want people who can chart their own course, not wait for instructions on where they need to turn next. So this is really what we're all about at the Alan B. Miller Entrepreneurship Center. And we believe that these things are going to be useful for students, those who decide they want to do a startup, and even those who don't, especially for those who may think they want to do something else. This is a set of skills and a mindset that's very helpful. So what I want to do now is jump back to why I think this is really important, and that's because of this statistic. So we know that about 8 or 9 out of 10 new ventures fail, and I'm using the term new ventures on purpose. This is either a startup, this is a new initiative within an existing company. The stats kind of look the same. So it's 8 to 9 out of 10 will fail depending on how you look at it. So there's outright failure within a portfolio, or there are companies that just fail to reach, or initiatives that fail to reach the projections, the targeted returns that they were after. So I want to ask you guys who are on the call, who are on the webinar, why do you think that is? So we've got another quick polling question, and we'll watch the results come in. What do you think is the primary reason that most ventures fail, most new ventures fail? Okay, we're looking at the answers come in. It looks like there's some folks who have potentially gone through the accelerator that we launched at New Richmond Ventures. All right. Okay, Mike, I don't think we need to leave that on there anymore. I think people are getting the point. So you can pull that polling question off. The answer is lack of customers. What we see in a lot of failures are amazing products, amazing services. It's a great business. The problem is nobody cared. And so we see this time and time again where the plan is executed against perfectly. They're on time. They built the product just like they said they were going to do. The problem was they did that and there weren't enough customers that cared about it. And so there's a really important question that we need to ask when we're doing new venture development. And the question isn't, can we do this? Often at New Richmond Ventures, we didn't hesitate in thinking that the smart people who are coming to present their ideas to us would be able to technologically pull this off. Our biggest question was, should they do it at all? Will anybody care? So there's a couple of other points there that I want to make, and so that is that many ventures, they operate under that assumption that they already know what the problem and the solution is, and then they frankly build the thing that they assume is going to be the right product, only to find out that it's not. And so some of the other answers that were in that poll factor into it. Running out of money is an answer that many people often say is the primary reason, but it's often connected to this lack of customers, right? They need more money to try to find who that right customer is, and sometimes you just run out of money before you actually do that. But the real problem is that there's a product searching for a customer, searching for a problem. But there's actually some good news here. So of the 1 or 2 out of 10 that succeed, we know that roughly 2/3 of them report that they drastically changed their plans along the way. So they started out as something, and then they became something different as the market responded to their business, to their new venture. So I want to share a couple of examples to illustrate this point. So the first is a startup that I'd be surprised if anybody has actually heard about. It's called The Point, and it got started about 2006 in Chicago. And the big idea here is that they were going to organize people around these community action campaigns. And so you could create a campaign to go clean up a park or to do something, but the big idea was this thing called the tipping point. And so if enough people would sign up for this campaign, then it would actually happen. And so they built this business according to their plan. They had a great product. The back end worked really well. The problem was nobody cared. They couldn't get traction with customers. And so in about 2010, they were in a lot of trouble, and the founders were in the process of returning capital to investors. And this business happened to be located in a building that had a pizza place in the bottom of the office complex. And the founder of the business thought, what if we could use our platform to, instead of organize a community campaign, what if I can get that pizza guy to give me a coupon, and if enough people sign up that they want that, then we'll give them the coupon. So hopefully this is sounding like a familiar company, because the point became Groupon. So that's Andrew Mason. That's the guy that literally saw that pizza place and realized we could pivot. We need to pivot not only our value proposition, but also our customers. We need to go after a different set of customers that maybe these same customers care about community action, but they care more about saving 25% on a pizza. And so there's a lot more of those people, it turns out. And that business went on to be pretty successful. And I bet that he wishes he sold to Google when they offered $6 billion back in 2010. But as some of you know, he actually turned that down. So there's another one. Actually, there are many, many more, but I've got another one that I want to share with you here. Again, this is a startup. This is in the late 90s. Confinity started with some really high-tech aspirations, and it all revolved around this wonderful device called a Palm Pilot. I actually had one of these. So their idea was that you would be able to, let's say you were at that same pizza place. Their idea would be that you could split the bill with your friend by using your Palm Pilot. You could actually beam money to one another using this Palm Pilot, and it would transmit signals out of the IR port of this Palm Pilot. And so right as they were getting ready to launch, as a part of their development, they actually merged with another startup started by a guy named Elon Musk, who's actually been in the news recently for his other ventures that have to do with electric vehicles and spaceships. And so that business actually became PayPal. So PayPal launched in 1999, but I really want to focus your attention on the primary value proposition there. I've circled it in red. And so it says PayPal lets you beam money to anybody with a Palm organizer. And so they launched with that as the primary value proposition and quickly realized that pretty much nobody cared about that part. Everybody cared about the second one, the one about the email address. And so PayPal quickly pivoted again, and they became the company that lets you send money to anybody with an email address. So this is yet another example of a company that started out with one idea, executed against that plan, only to realize that they needed to pivot. This idea of pivoting is actually really important in new ventures. So I've got one more that I want to share with you. This is a startup that launched called Bourbon. And it's maybe not the bourbon you're thinking of. This was actually a check-in app, a mobile check-in app, kind of like Foursquare. There were a lot of these that were forming back in about 2010. And so Bourbon launched. It actually had better features than many of the other competitors that were out there. But again, like the others, it really just wasn't getting traction. They had raised venture capital, and they were, again, in the process of returning capital to investors when they started to really pick apart their data. And what they realized when they looked at all of the utilization statistics for the app, people weren't using most of their features, but they were using one. So again, let's say you were checking in using this app, and you got to that location. You could actually use that feature right in the middle of the app. It was a photo icon. You could take a photo, and they had these cool filters that you could apply as you're checking in. And so many of you are probably making the connection that this check-in app became Instagram. And yes, then Instagram was bought for $1 billion by Facebook a couple of years ago. Again, this is a pivot. This, in particular, this was a value proposition pivot. What you find, so these are just 3 examples of many. You can look to almost every startup that we see today, and trace back some different kind of start. And I think it's really important to recognize there's this myth that entrepreneurs come up with this amazing idea and then they just have to execute that. And what we see is that that's not the case. Sometimes that happens, but I think they get very lucky when that does happen. So we want to iterate to success on purpose. We don't want to be like Andrew Mason and be returning capital to investors when we finally have that epiphany right before it's too late. We want to have a process that will help us do this. And thankfully, there is a process to do that. So there's a process, a tool. So the process is called customer development, and the tool that you use to do that is business modeling. And so this is actually what we looked at New Richmond Ventures. Instead of looking at business plans, we looked at business models. And we also then helped these early stage companies do something called customer development. And I'm going to share a little bit about what that is in a minute. But first I want to do one last poll, and that is, what is a business model? So I've given you a couple of options here, and this will illustrate a point about business models, I hope. So take a minute and answer this poll, and then we're going to move on. So it looks like there's certainly a popular answer there in B. I'm seeing some other answers come in for some of the others. I think that's enough time there. So answers A, B, and C were actually correct. D was not correct. A short version of a business plan is not really the right way to think about a business model. But the problem with A, B, and C being the right answers is that there's really not a shared understanding of what a business model is. And that has been the case for many, many years. Although recently there has been this movement where there is a gold standard for what we're talking about when we say, what is a business model? And that is the Alex Osterwalder Business Model Canvas. It's a mouthful. And so what I want to do for a 50-second clip, I want to show you a video that describes the kind of business model that I'm talking about here. So I'm going to show this video, and then we're going to come back to the lecture. All right.
An organization's business model can be described with 9 basic building blocks: your customer segments, your value proposition for each segment, the channels to reach customers, customer relationships you establish, the revenue streams you generate, the key resources and key activities you require to create value, the key partners, and the cost structure of the business model. But it's not sufficient to just enumerate the 9 building blocks. What you really want to do is to map them out on a pre-structured canvas. This is what we call the business model canvas, a tool that helps you map, discuss, design, and invent new business models.
There's actually much more to that video, and we'll actually send that clip around after the webinar is complete. So hopefully you're seeing why, well, I actually want to illustrate why this is not just a short version of a business plan. You can fill out a business model canvas and have it be the short version of a business plan, but that's not the intention. It's meant to be a dynamic tool that you use over a period of time to validate whether or not you have a sustainable and scalable and profitable venture worth moving forward with. So a business model describes the rationale of how an organization creates, captures, and delivers value. And so this is the Alex Osterwalder canvas here. It's got 9 building blocks, and it turns out to be something that's really helpful to use as a sort of a checkpoint. We use this in accelerators, and in New Richmond Ventures, we use this even when we got business plans. We use this to better understand that business. It sort of leveled the playing field where we could understand lots of different kinds of businesses using this same tool. So this is the canvas that is used all around the world. There are some variations that are starting to pop up but this is kind of the gold standard that most people are teaching. Most schools are using this, and most entrepreneurs are now familiar with this canvas. So there's something that everybody needs to know, though, when you first fill this out, especially when you're an early stage venture, and that is this: that the first time you fill it out, most of the blocks are going to contain guesses. And this requires some humility on the part of the founders to admit that some of these things are actually guesses, and there's a value to trying to validate these. And so from an entrepreneur's perspective, particularly when you're raising money, it's difficult to admit that parts of your business model are actually hypotheses. But I can guarantee you that sooner or later the investors are going to figure out that these things are guesses and not facts. So it's important to, again, step back from the business model canvas when you first fill it out and look at which of your guesses, which of these hypotheses are the most important, such that if you're actually wrong, there might not be a business here. And so we need to process, and the process to do that is called customer development. So this is an iterative process to try to find, again, a sustainable, scalable, and profitable business model. So customer development uses the business model canvas as kind of like a scorecard. And so you'll notice that these are iterative loops. The idea is that you're going to have to go through a couple of cycles of each of these steps before you've found that you actually do have a business model. And it's okay to have to go back a step. So one of the interesting things about customer development is that it's really two halves. So the left-hand side we call the search mode, or the search side of customer development, and then the right-hand side is execution. So business plans are fantastic for execution because you already have found that business model that will work. And so then you need a plan to execute against. So the problem with business plans as they're traditionally used is that it's the wrong tool at the wrong time. So the better tool to use while you're in search mode is a business model canvas, recognizing that this is an iterative and dynamic process. If you spend months and months writing a business plan, you are not likely to want to change that. It takes a lot of effort. You've got a lot of eggs in that basket. But if you have a one-page diagram that describes your business model, the whole idea is that you change that on a weekly basis as you do these experiments. So I'm really quickly going to go through the two parts of the search mode of customer development. So the first is this customer discovery step. And this is a really important step and very difficult actually for entrepreneurs. And that is that you have to stop selling and start listening. This is really hard to do. This is hard for me to do, especially when you have what you think is a great idea. What we typically want to do is share our idea with these people and get validation for how amazing it is. But we need to stop that, and we actually just need to start asking questions about what's going on in this potential customer's world, right? If you're trying to sell a product to salespeople, then you need to interact with salespeople and find out what's going on with them. What are the problems that they actually have in their world? You want to test these hypotheses. So the way to do that is this, and this is obviously a big simplification of how difficult it actually is to go talk to potential customers. But this is meant to illustrate that you're not doing this behind your computer screen in your startup office in your garage. This is not coding. This is talking with real people. This is going out into the market and saying, hey, salesperson, we've been looking at this space, and we think that this problem exists. Tell me, what are the issues that you deal with? This is a step that a lot of people miss. And instead of doing this, what usually is in the bubble is, hey, we built this really cool product. What do you think? And so most people will say, oh, it's really cool. I like that. Keep going. And they're really doing that so you'll stop bugging them. So you don't want to get this incorrect validation about your product too soon. You want to find out what people are dealing with. So once you've actually validated that there is a problem that people want to have solved, that's another important thing. You want to validate that it's a problem at a high enough frequency and amplitude that people want to solve it. There are some problems that we encounter that are just they're just kind of pesky, and we're not willing to pay something to actually solve those problems. But once we've found a really meaty problem that we can solve, then we can actually go back to those customers with something called a minimum viable product, an MVP. So there's a misconception about what this is. And what you see when these new methodologies come into the market, you see the buzzwords actually catching on before the real meaning of the word has caught on. So a lot of times people think of MVPs as a cheap version of the whole product. And so this is sort of a version of the website that doesn't really work very well. And that's not actually what we're talking about when we're talking about MVPs. It's something that allows you to learn something about a hypothesis that you have, one of those guesses. And so let's say that one of your guesses is that people will value the time that your web app would save them. And so in order to do whatever process that you're intending to save time on, you could either build these very complex algorithms and put those out there and see if people value it, or you could simulate that. You could do something called a smoke and mirrors test, where you are simulating a complex part of your product, maybe on the back end by using a bunch of interns to crunch numbers. Everybody on the front end thinks it's real, but you've created this prototype in a very streamlined fashion in order to test that assumption. And once you've got that validation that customers actually do value it, you're able to build that out with some degree of certainty that it's worth the time and effort to do that. What we want to try to avoid is building something that nobody wants. And so an MVP is a helpful tool to do that. And so you might build lots of MVPs as you're testing out your idea. So the next important part of customer discovery, again, this is the first loop within the customer development process. The exit criteria. This is how you tell when you're done. You know what your customers' top problems are. You also know that they're willing to pay to solve them. You know what they're willing to pay. As you've done the customer discovery, you're finding out what are the other solutions that are out there that they're currently using, and what do those cost, right? A big red flag is that if there are other solutions out there that cost nothing, right? Now there's a price of zero that's an anchor in the marketplace. You also want to know, does your MVP solve that problem? And not only do you think it solves the problem, but you've got validation from real-life customers that think it solves the problem as well. And the final thing is that you can actually draw a day in the life of the customer. You need to be able to know what they're going through. And so often, I find that with students and with entrepreneurs, they haven't really interacted with customers nearly enough, but they've built some product that they assume this hypothetical customer will really want. And so one of the first questions that I would ask entrepreneurs when they would come into my office looking for capital was, who is your customer and what problem are you trying to solve? And I was amazed at first that many entrepreneurs couldn't answer that problem. And then I knew I needed to work them through this business model and the customer development process. So that's the first loop in the customer development methodology. The second loop is customer validation. So again, at this point, you've got something called problem-solution fit. You know that there's a problem, and you know your solution actually solves it. In customer validation, what you're trying to do here is begin to sell the product into this customer segment. And to do that, you're trying to come up with a repeatable and scalable sales process. Those are really important. A lot of times we see validation of traction that's not really true validation. You've got some early sales, but they weren't through the actual channels that you would use in real life. And so the other thing to recognize in customer validation is that you're likely talking to early adopters. You're not talking to the mass market. The early adopters are the customers who have that problem that you're trying to solve to such a degree that they're willing to put up with these early versions of your product, buggy versions that might not work very well. So it's important to keep in mind that you're looking at these early adopters at the first phase of this process. And so the exit criteria for the customer validation stage, this is really important. This is when you actually have a sales roadmap. You know how to sell into these organizations. So it's one thing to use the business model canvas and say, hospitals are our customer segment. Well, that's fine, but how do you actually sell into the hospital? Who buys that product? And what is the sales cycle for that product? Who needs to influence that person who writes the checks, right? We really want entrepreneurs to validate the entire sales cycle so that there is a likelihood of finding something that's sustainable and scalable. And the gold standard of traction, of validation at this stage, is that you actually have some orders for your product. One of the things that I see is often done is that entrepreneurs will put their product out there and they will price it for free for a while. They'll say, well, we're in beta, so we're not going to charge. Well, you're actually not testing one of the important parts of your value proposition, or of your business model in that case, and that's the cost, right? We want to find out if people are willing to exchange some value for this product that you've created. And so the final part of the customer validation, part of the customer development methodology, is whether or not you have a financial model that makes sense. This has a lot to do with how you sell into these organizations. If it takes a year to sell into a hospital, well, then your product better have a pretty high margin. It better sell for a lot of money. So we want to check the financial model in this step of the process. So this is the first two steps of the customer development process. And these are really essential, and frankly, most startups will fail before they've actually found validation in these first two steps. But if you've gone through these two, then it's likely that you've found a business model that will scale and that will be profitable. And so you've sort of finished searching for the model, and now you can actually execute. And this is the step that most people never go through. They're trying to execute a model before they've found a model that's worth executing. So I've obviously simplified those steps for the sake of this webinar. It's actually difficult to do those two loops. One, and I've mentioned this before, is that it requires a hefty dose of humility. You have to admit that you don't have all of the answers starting out, right? So you have to step back from that business model and honestly say, we think this is true, but we're going to validate it by doing these experiments. And the second reason that this is difficult is that we have this pesky tendency as humans to only listen to the feedback that supports our preconceived notions, right? This is called confirmation bias, and all of us have it. So we will seek out those responses that actually support our desire to move ahead. And so we have to very intentionally tamp that down. And then finally, this is difficult because, frankly, it's easier to just work on the product, to code, or to build this solution than it is to find these customers and to talk with them and find out what's really going on. So that's why it's important to actually implement a rigorous process. I can tell you these things and you can perhaps say, okay, this sounds sensible, we should do something like this. But without a process, it becomes very difficult to do. So using the business model canvas as a tool and the customer development methodology as your process really helps you to do these things that actually in practice are quite difficult. So the last thing that I want to leave you with is this quote, and this sort of gets at the idea of some of these elements that are difficult, and that is that there are no facts inside the building, so you have to get outside and talk to customers. And I have to remind my students this all the time. They want to do these projects by doing it from their dorm room, right? By using Google to find the answers to the questions. But you can't do that. The answers are held with the customers that you need to talk with. And so, by the way, this guy Steve Blank that you see on the screen he originated this customer development methodology, which then spawned this whole lean startup movement that many of you may be aware of now. So there are no facts inside the building. Get outside and talk to customers is probably the biggest recommendation that I can give to anybody who's on the call right now who has a new venture that they want to take to the next level. You can talk with your team as much as you'd like, but until you actually talk to people who you believe will be your customers, you likely have some pretty big, important assumptions that are left untested. So with that, I want to open it up to some other questions that have been coming up as we've been talking, and I'll answer any other questions that you have now. If we run out of time, I'll actually respond to those questions in a follow-up message after the webinar.
Thank you, Graham. The first question that we have that's come up is from Lucas Wahl, who says, after a couple of years interviewing people, my experience is that using the lean approach suggested here is a helpful and suggested there, I think, is a helpful in clarifying what doesn't work in the marketplace, but it is not the same as finding what will work.
Yeah, I think finding what won't work certainly isn't the same thing as what will work. This reminds me of something that some people say when they hear about the lean startup or the customer development methodology, and that's a quote that people attribute to Henry Ford. I don't know if he actually said it, and that was, if I asked customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, right? And maybe that is true. Maybe that's what they said. But as innovators, as product developers, it's our job to be able to interpret that and understand what they truly need. Because many times customers can't actually articulate what they want, which is why we build these MVPs to figure out if what will work is actually what we think is the right idea. So the MVP becomes the critical link there.
Joseph Wilbur has asked an interesting question. Any tips for making, tips for making this happen for new ventures within large organizations with a culture that doesn't support it inherently?
Yeah,
you and I talk about that all the time.
Yeah, this is a great question. So one of the things that I would recommend doing in that case is that you choose a sort of a pocket within that organization to try to do this. And this is going to be an experimental approach. You have to have buy-in from the likely small team that's willing to do that you're going to experiment, you might fail, it's going to be iterative. So it's much better to do that in large organizations on a very small piece, kind of a skunkworks idea. And we've been doing this, actually, we've been doing consulting with some very large government organizations that would never adopt a process like this whole hog and put it into the entire organization, but they have adopted it in small pockets, which then starts to influence the other elements of that organization. So I would say start small, get some results, and that gets buy-in. You know, once you can go to some of those senior leaders and say, we thought this was true at first, and we were going to build this solution, but instead we developed this prototype, and this is what we found out. It's a completely different direction. Those kinds of results can really sway the naysayers in a larger organization.
Just need patience.
Yeah.
NRV has logged in. There are a number of online tools that will allow you to survey people for a small fee. Would you recommend these tools, and if so, which ones? Yeah, actually, there are a lot of tools, and maybe in the follow-up, I'll share some links to those tools. But the one thing that I'll say about surveys is that wouldn't be the first place that I would go to get validation from customers. There's nothing like talking to a customer face-to-face. You can then see if, because you're looking at them, whether or not they actually experience these problems that you're talking about. We need to see their reaction, to see their body language, because what we're looking for is, again, that high frequency, high amplitude problem, and the amplitude is hard to tell through a survey. It's also difficult to tell through a phone call. And so what I say, and I tell this to all my students and many entrepreneurs, there's really no substitute for talking with customers face-to-face. It also helps you to find out where they actually are, right? It lets you validate another assumption about your distribution channels and how you're going to find customers. So face-to-face is certainly the most recommended approach to use when you're using this methodology. Second best would be a video chat. If you have to do a phone call, then that's fine, but you then have the risk that, when you say, do you have this, this problem? What do you think about this idea? People say, yeah, I think that's great. And then they're sort of putting the phone over there and, making a face that you can't see that says,
I need to get off the phone with this person. This idea doesn't make sense at all. So face-to-face is the best option there.
We have a couple of interesting questions that have come in. First, Bob Camfield, and then Kim Johnson. Bob's is, are there any new needs or just new solutions or a combination? I mean, how many times are there new things that we say, how did we ever live without that? So
right.
I would argue the first, but.
Yeah, so I think, so there are some basic human needs, right, that I think stay the same. And so you look at some solutions out there like Facebook, and that's not really, I don't know if that's really solving a problem, but it's meeting a need that we have for communicating with one another. So there are needs like that. I think there are new wants that come up, and some businesses can succeed by really solving for those deep wants that people have. I don't think it's easy to find solutions that are a part of a business that succeed without pointing back to a very important need or a very important want that is at the base of that. And maybe that's at the crux of this whole idea. It's not about the solution. It's about the problem. And entrepreneurs need to recognize that customers don't really care about your product or service. They care about themselves. They care about the problems that they have. And your solution, your business, is just a way to solve that problem.
Interesting. Kim Johnson's question is, I am helping an entrepreneur friend refine his market entry strategy, but the biggest challenge for me is providing hard feedback and pushing towards doing something on the hard and humbling analysis you described. Do you have any tips on how to approach these issues firmly but with sensitivity? And keeping the friendship, I guess. Yeah.
When I was first introduced to this process, I was actually out at Berkeley, and I saw Steve Blank teaching this course to a group of graduate students. And they ran the course in a flipped classroom model where they had the instructors, who were actually venture capitalists, sitting in the back, and the students were in the front, and they were presenting their progress on their business model canvas from the last week to that current week. And first off, you were not even allowed to present if you hadn't talked with 10 customers between the previous week and that week. So that was the first thing. And the second was that you had to articulate what you believed as students were still the hypotheses. It's so easy for us to fool ourselves, to say, we know all this is true, all we need to do is execute the model. But I'd say, being firm and actually being realistic about those guesses is really the best way that you can care for that friend, because the alternative is that they spend sometimes years of their lives and lots of money building something that just fails, right? That tanks. And so that's right. Your hard feedback, which could be difficult in the moment, might end up being the thing that causes them either to pivot or to recognize that there might not be something there.
Plus, Kim, you can share this webinar with him or her. Tyler Wang has a question. Product versus service. If you're in a startup providing a professional service to enterprise customers or an existing product platform, would the business model process vary?
Okay. Product versus service. So there really isn't a big difference. You don't use a different tool if it's a product or a service, if that's the question. The business model canvas works for both. Obviously, you'll have different items in those 9 building blocks. Now, the enterprise customers do present some interesting challenges for the customer development process because you can't just walk into these large corporations and do the customer development. You frequently need to work with other companies that are maybe in that same genre and work your way up, right? You don't want to run experiments with your most important customers early on. So see if you can work with some other organizations to get some validation before you go there to the bigger companies?
Well, we've just got one from Jean Cumby, who is an entrepreneur. My newly patented product solves 3 distinct problems for 3 somewhat overlapping markets. It's the buckshot approach, hit them all, or laser-focused approach, target only one, to marketing recommended.
So my recommendation there is focused. When we talk with entrepreneurs who say something to the effect of everybody is our market, we get very concerned. It's hard to market to everybody. And similarly, if you have 3 sort of different customer segments, likely there are different elements of that product that resonate. You almost always have a different value proposition when you're talking about a different customer. And so what I would do in this case is do some market analysis. What is the market opportunity of each of those 3 distinct customer segments, and find out which might be the best opportunity to proceed with first. But if it's easy enough, if they actually do overlap, you might find a way to test your MVP in all 3 sort of efficiently. But if it is very different, then you're going to want to pick, I think.
We have Ryan has typed in wanting to know what books you would recommend. And I think you mentioned a book yesterday, too, that you and I were talking.
Ryan, that's a great question. And it's a great question because I actually have a slide to answer it, so that's always nice. So these are a handful of books that are really good that describe this process. Probably the first one that I would recommend reading is The Lean Startup, the blue one there in the middle, by Eric Ries. Eric Ries is kind of responsible for this movement really spreading. Eric was a student of Steve Blank's several years ago and came to Steve Blank, who, by the way, he's not just an academic who came up with this process. He's an 8 or 9 times serial entrepreneur who has been very successful. So this is a field tested process. Eric Ries came to Steve Blank looking for money, and Steve said, well, I'll invest in your company if you audit this class, which was a class called the Lean Launchpad offered at Stanford. And out of that class, Eric Ries came up with this idea called the Lean Startup. And so these other books are also really good. Running Lean is a fantastic book if the startup that you're working on is in the digital space. It's great for software products. Business Model Generation is a crowdsourced book, actually. This is from Alex Osterwalder, the author of the Business Model Canvas. This is another really, really good book. And one that's not on this list, though, I need to update the slide. I just recently started to use this in my courses. It's called Little Bets. So if you look it up on Amazon, you can find it there. Little Bets is a fantastic book, and it talks about the importance of, rather than placing sometimes very risky big bets, it's often smarter to place small bets. And the book has lots of examples of people where you think they just have this amazing plan and they just execute it, when in fact they placed hundreds of small bets to get to that place. So Little Bets is another good book.
We've had somebody else is typing in, but while we wait for that to come up, I'd like to thank everybody for participating, and also point out the Kelly Miner, who's behind all of this and making it happen, along with Mike Hayes. I thank them, but one of the things Kelly did was map the participants, and we have people from all over the country and, in fact, internationally, so that was kind of fun to see. I'm delighted that you're coming in from all over the world. Tyler Wang says, have you read 0 to 1?
Yep, that's a good book. I recommend that one too.
Okay, I think we're close to the 1 o'clock stop time. We will send out the webinar to everyone who has registered, as we always do. And I think Graham has generously offered to send a few links to some other thoughts that he might have that would be helpful to all of you. And if anyone still has a question, type it in. Keep typing. We will continue to answer them after the fact, if that's helpful. So don't feel like you don't have. If you have a question, we'll get it answered.
All
But
right.
in the meantime, I'd like to thank Graham very much for taking the time and all the effort that goes into this, and of course Mike in the background. And I'm sorry, we're getting a little note here from Mike.
All right,
And
everybody.
thank you all.
Thank
So,
you.
See you next time, sort of, not really, but we will be there, not being able to see you. Thank you.